This paper is joint with Titan Alon, who is from UC San Diego, who's also in the audience, and Natalie Backus, my colleague from Princeton. So this paper is motivated by the fact that we've seen really large rises in student debt over time. So the panel on the left shows you the average debt of graduating seniors who borrowed, and this has roughly tripled since the mid-1990s. In addition to rising, the student debt is actually a really important part of people's net worth as well. So the graph on the right gives you by percentile of net worth for young people who did graduate, their net worth, and then plotting their student debt. So immediately you can see, particularly for the bottom 50th percentile, student debt accounts for a large fraction of their net worth. So it's rising and it's important for these young groups of people. So that leads us to ask the question, how does debt early in life affect the profile of labor earnings over the rest of their life? And there's many different ways we might think debt could affect labor earnings. It can affect the occupation that you choose, the job that you choose, the degree of job investment that you have when you're working. So to study this, we first provide empirical evidence on the effect of debt on initial earnings and returns to experience. We're then going to have a life cycle model where people are different in talent and wealth. They have college and occupation choice, and crucially, they have borrowing constraints, and that's going to help us generate the facts that I'm going to show you. The reason we want to build this model is because we want to ultimately ask questions like, what is the implication of debt for aggregate productivity and the allocation of talent? Now, we're still actually building out and working on this last point, so I'm really going to focus this talk on the first two. So let me start with the empirical facts. The data we have comes from NLSY 97. So this is household individual level panel data that has information on education and labor outcomes. We're going to use this data first to estimate earnings profiles. So essentially what we estimate with the data for it is running the regression for each individual I in UT, log of earnings or log wages regressed on constant, some demographic controls which are listed here, years of experience, and then we split out in the second line the effect of debt. So D is the total dollar borrowing from all student loan resources and interacted with years of experience. So alpha 2 gives you what's the effect of debt on your initial earnings or wage, and alpha 3 gives you what's the effect of debt on your returns to experience. Now, if we just estimate this with OLS, we can actually already see very different profiles for someone with and without debt. But if we just run OLS, it can actually reflect many things. It might reflect, for example, selection that's related to family wealth. And if we think family wealth is correlated with ability, that can be what's part of driving these coefficients. Econometrically, it means the debt is correlated with unobserved ability in the residuals. It might also reflect causal effects of debt on earnings. So in addition to just having the correlations with the OLS, we also estimated the IV version of this, instrumenting for the debt level and its interaction with years of experience. And the reason why we want this causal effect is because when we go to the model, one of the experiments or thought process we want to do is varying parameters that directly affect the level of grants and debt funding. And we want to use that in the model to think about the effects on earnings and allocation of talent. So these estimates are going to feed very naturally into the model. We instrument for debt in two ways. So here we're not really innovating on the instrument. We're going to rely heavily on the literature. There's two ways the literature has instrumented for individual level debt. The first is using a cross-cohort variation in the share of grants relative to total funding in a college. So the idea behind this across cohort within college type variation is you're essentially comparing, for example, two different cohorts that went to the same college type. Because they went to the same college, they're probably similar in abilities, but they happen to have different grant fundings. It turns out there's lots of variation in grant funding over time related to state and federal variation that's potentially orthogonal to ability. So that's kind of the intuition behind this IV that's used in these papers. Now you might think that maybe cohorts are still somewhat different. So we also did robustness for the second IV that had an instrument within the same cohort and college type that relates to variations in federal loan limits that are related to the month in which you're born. Now, I don't have time to do both, so I'm really just going to focus the discussion on the first one and just tell you that the two give you very similar qualitative stories. The exact magnitudes are a little different because this is a different sample, but the story is going to be very qualitatively robust. What are the results? So here are the results. The first two columns give you the grants IV estimates. The last two give you it if you use that federal loan limit, age IV. The first finding we have, if we zoom in on this column here, is the effect of debt on your initial earnings. So we find that every $1,000 increase in debt causes an individual to have 3% higher initial earnings, which is about $500 more initial earnings, including people on the extensive margin. Now this is quite large and significant, and by the way, is actually well known. It's very much in the line of what a bunch of papers have estimated to be the effect of debt. So this kind of gives us some reassurance that what we're doing with this IV is in line with what people have estimated. What is new in this paper is we document a trade-off. Now, although they have higher initial earnings, what we find is that subsequently, over the next 10 to 15 years, they have lower average returns to experience. How much lower? Every $1,000 of debt leads to returns to experience being about 1.3% lower each year. This is quite sizable, especially if we look at how people's, these young people's earnings each year are growing. They're growing by about 7.75%. So debt is having a big impact on people's life cycle earnings profiles. So given it does seem to matter, we delved into a little bit more to understand why does debt matter. And one of the features that we found to be important for explaining this is your people's first occupation in industry choice that they endogenously select into when they graduate. So that's what this second column here is doing. We're putting in occupation fixed effects and its interaction with years of experience. And what's really striking is these point estimates, if you compare one in column 2, is these point estimates go down by 40 to 60%. So what is this telling us? It's telling us that part of the reason why we get these debt effects on earnings is because people with higher amounts of debt are endogenously selecting into occupations that pay you more upfront initially, but subsequently have a flatter wage profile. Another way of just showing you this, just even putting aside the IV, just in the raw data alone, we can actually see some evidence of these patterns jumping out at us. So this is now going to the CPS. So I'm just taking 3-digit occupations from the CPS. And here you see log initial earnings, and along the x-axis is log earnings growth over 15 years. And what you see is a negative relationship where you have occupations that pay more initially, but have a lower returns to experience. This is not a mechanical effect, it's what's coming out through the data. The second thing to note is the size of the bubbles. The size of the bubbles is the average relative amount of student debt of someone who chose to go into that occupation. So essentially what you're seeing is that there's some people that have lots of debt, choosing occupations that pay more in terms of initial earnings, but subsequently have a flatter earnings growth profile. I don't have time to go into it, but we did project these occupations on a number of characteristics about the occupations, for example, from ONETs. And just to tell you, one of them that seemed important for explaining this negative profile is the importance of continued on-the-job training. So essentially those with high initial earnings, low returns to experience reported less importance for continuous on-the-job training. So to sum up, what are the three things we've seen? The first is more debt leads to higher initial earnings, something that's well documented in the literature. What's new in this paper is 2 and 3. We see that there's a trade-off in terms of lower returns to experience over the next 10 to 15 years. And the first occupation choice is important for understanding this. With these three facts in mind, we then wanted to set up a model that is able to capture them so we can start thinking about what does this imply for human capital and the allocation of talent and different types of grant funding schemes. So the model that we have that generates those findings is a life cycle model with credit constraints. And credit constraints are important because when they bind, people can't borrow as much as they want to through the asset market. So how do they borrow? They borrow by distorting their human capital. And they distort their human capital in 2 ways. One is within an occupation human capital decisions, like in Ben-Peref. So in these models, people don't invest as much in on-the-job training, just like what we were kind of getting the hint of from the data. But the second way, which is new in this paper, is they might also distort their occupation choice. And that's when you potentially get misallocation of talent. In the rest of the talk, I'm going to take us through a stylized model so I can really highlight the economics behind why constraints can lead to distortions. So because it's stylized, I'm going to purposely abstract from some things like occupation switching, preferences for occupations, which are partly non-wage utility, labor force participation, but obviously these are things we want to add into the model when we start doing the quantitative side. Okay, so let me tell you the stylized model. There's young and there's old. People are born heterogeneous and they're different in terms of their initial wealth. So that might include things like your differences in parental background. And they're different in terms of their occupation talent. You can have correlations between the two. We're going to have one asset in this stylized model with standard limits. But obviously, when we have student debt, we want to add that with specific features of student debt. In the pre-period, people choose to go to college or not. They might also get some funding to go to college. They also make a decision about the occupation. Their occupation is going to be different in terms of the effective hourly wage that's paid WK. Their initial human capital is a function of whether they go to college or not, and then that human capital is going to grow over their life. It's going to grow depending on how much on-the-job investment they make S. I want you to think about S as being a reduced form way of capturing anything that requires you to sacrifice earnings today, essentially when you're young, that pays off in the future. So this might include things like skill acquisition, building networks, spending more time searching for the perfect job that really matches you. That's essentially what S is meant to encompass. The other thing I want to sort of highlight with this Ben-Peref setting is that talent affects your human capital. So the more talented you are, the more it pays off to actually make the investment. Alpha governs the curvature, so the return to making this investment, which you might potentially think could be occupation specific. So an individual chooses occupation K to maximize lifetime utility. The utility given they chose occupation K is standard. They're just going to maximize their utility subject to their budget constraints, and then not going to college is going to be modeled as an outside option. Okay, so with that set up, I'm going to first describe people's choices within an occupation, how credit constraint distorts that, and then I'm going to then describe how constraints can also impact on your occupation choice. So starting first within an occupation. Within an occupation, when someone is unconstrained, they can essentially shift resources in 2 ways. They can shift resources by investing in their financial asset, which pays a return of 1 plus R, the interest rate. They can also shift resources by investing in themselves in terms of the on-the-job training, the S. And they're going to do it up to the point where they equate the returns to financial assets to the returns to human capital, which is this term here. And then if you rewrite this, we can see that the person's effective hours of investment is given by this expression here. And the one thing I wanted to point out is that talent enters. So the more talented you are, the more you want to invest in yourself because it really pays off the next period. Now, what happens if someone becomes constrained? Well, if they become constrained, it means they can't borrow as much as they want to through the financial asset market. So then how do they borrow to smooth consumption? They borrow essentially by distorting their human capital, and they do that by investing less in the on-the-job training S than they would otherwise. If they invest less in S, that's going to increase their initial earnings at the expense of lower returns to experience, exactly what we were getting when we looked at the data. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the shadow price of borrowing is no longer 1 plus R, the interest rate. It's actually the cost that comes through the human capital, this term here. And the other thing I wanted to point out with this shadow price of borrowing is that it's an increasing function of talent, this theta. In other words, it's really costly for talented people to be constrained because when they distort their human capital, it's especially costly for these talented guys. That's within the occupation. Now I'm going to move to describe what's kind of relatively new in this paper, which is the effect of the constraints on your choice of occupation. And what we can see is that in this model, constraints might lead you to make different occupation choices compared to if there was no borrowing frictions in this economy. That's essentially what we're calling misallocation of talent. And one way to characterize this degree of misoccupation of talent and start thinking about parameters that affect that is by characterizing who's actually constrained. A person is constrained if the choice of assets they have hits the limit. I'm going to just give closed form solutions for the limit being 0, but it's really easy to just allow that not to be 0. Now, if we rewrite the choice of assets in the talent and wage space, we get this expression here. Essentially, we get a threshold cutoff for talent. Above that level, if you have a talent above that threshold, the individual will be constrained. Another way of saying this is more talented individuals are more likely to be constrained. And it's quite intuitive because the more talented you are, the more you really want to invest in yourself when you're young. So it means you're giving up more and more of your initial earnings. So for a given level of assets and wages, it's just going to make you more likely to be constrained. So with these threshold cutoffs, which are occupation specific, we can now start defining misallocation of talent. I'm going to talk through just graphically an example to make it concrete. Suppose there are 2 occupations, 1 and 2. Then a person is going to draw a vector of talents, theta 1 and theta 2. And there are 4 cases that this person can fall into, depending on their talent relative to the threshold. They might be unconstrained in both, they might be constrained in both, or they're unconstrained in 1 and not 2, or are they constrained in 2 and not 1? So how does this look graphically without showing you all the algebra behind it? This is a space where you have all the possible draws of talent of theta 2 here and all the possible draws of talent of theta 1 on the y-axis. These are the threshold cutoffs, and notice there's 4 quadrants. So a single point is a person who draws a joint vector of talents. So if a person draws a vector of talents in this region, then they're unconstrained in both occupations. If they draw a vector of talent in this region, they're constrained in both occupations. Here they're constrained in 1 and not 2, and constrained in 2 and not 1. So we can start talking about what are the occupation choices that people make given their talent draw. Well, it actually also depends not just on talent, but also wages of the different occupations. So I'm going to start with a baseline case, which is suppose there is no dispersion of wages across the 2 occupations. Well, if there's no effective wage dispersion, the only thing driving people's decisions about what occupation to take is talent. They're only going to sort on talent because there's no dispersion in W. And that's why you've got this 45-degree line here. Everyone above here is more talented in occupation 1, so they're going to choose occupation 1. And everyone below here chooses occupation 2. This is true regardless of whether there are boring frictions or not in this economy, because they're sorting on occupation based on skill. And so when there's no dispersion, there is no misallocation of talent. Now, obviously, this is...
So you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Obviously, this is very different when you start having differences in the occupations in their effective hourly wages. So suppose that occupation 2 has a higher effective wage than 1. What does it do to people's choices? Well, starting first with the frictionless model. So here people can borrow as much as they want. So here, even if they can borrow as much as they want, that 45-degree line shifts up, and it shifts up because you're getting paid more per effective hourly wage in occupation 2 than 1. So there's more people, given the talent draw, choosing to be in occupation 2. Now, the interesting thing is, what does this look like if we then put in borrowing frictions? Well, if we put in borrowing frictions, that line actually looks much steeper. So this black line here is characterizing the choices if you have borrowing frictions in the economy. And then the shaded region is what we're calling misallocation of talent. So to make it really concrete, consider a point right here. This is someone who would have chosen to be in occupation 1 if they could freely borrow. And they're more talented in occupation 1 than in occupation 2. But when constraints start binding, the guy over here would choose to switch into occupation 2 because it pays them more in terms of effective hourly wages and leads to higher initial earnings. So that's exactly the region we're calling misallocation of talent. They're choosing to be in 2, even though they're more talented in 1, and they would have chosen something different if they could freely borrow. Now, the question is then, what are the parameters that shift around this misallocation of talent? Well, one of them, I think, which you might already be able to get a sense of, is the level of assets. And another way of saying a level of assets shifting around is changes in the level of grants, which change your initial wealth. And essentially what happens is if we give people more and more initial wealth or more grants, that's going to actually shift that constraint line inwards. So this is the dashed line originally, and it shifts it inwards. And the more initial wealth they have, the more it shifts in, because the constraints become less binding. And at the limit, you kind of reach this line here, and there's no misallocation of talent. And then if people become more constrained, you kind of shift to the left. Why am I bringing this up? Well, circling back to the data that you saw earlier when we had our IVs, that was exactly the thought experiment we were doing. We're shifting around grants as the instrument that affects debt. And there we saw it affect the returns to experience initial earnings. Here, that's exactly the trade-off that people are making. But it's quite clear in this model that it's distorting occupation choice, leading to misallocation of talent. So to sum up, what does the model sort of predict? It predicts student debt leads to higher initial earnings, lower returns to experience, both within the occupation as well as distortion to occupation choice. Where we're heading with this is we're in the process of building out the quantitative side. So we have features of student debt, more general BEMPREF setting, the production function, and we want to close out with the government and labor markets. And we want to do this so that ultimately where we're moving with this is to ask questions like, given the rise in student debt that you saw at the beginning, what are the effects on aggregate productivity? Is it contributing towards the slowdown in productivity growth? Secondly, has the allocation of talent changed over time because of increases in the price of college? And lastly, can the allocation of talent change if we adopted an income-based repayment scheme instead? Okay, so that concludes the presentation. Thanks so much for listening.
Okay, so we move to Elena now, who is going to discuss the paper.
So Arlene just presented what I think is a fascinating and important paper on a topical question for the debate on inequality. We prize higher education as an equalizing force that affords individuals the opportunity for life cycle socioeconomic achievement. So a critical question is whether educational systems are indeed structured so as to allow individuals and society to realize the full benefit of an education. The specific questions that Elena and co-authors pose is the following. How student debt early in life affects life cycle profiles of earnings that individuals end up experiencing, and how this effect in turn impacts the accumulation of human capital in an economy and aggregate productivity. The idea of the paper is simple and I would say compelling. As occupations differ in the combination of starting wages and wage growth they offer, the need to repay possibly large debts skews individuals towards choosing occupations that are characterized by high starting wages but low wage growth with experience. Since higher wage growth tends to reward higher level of human capital acquisition, that may then cause substantial distortions by depressing human capital and output growth. Important for this mechanism is the notion that occupations with steeper wage profiles require more active investment in human capital, that is sacrificing more time that could be otherwise spent working and earning a wage. They're thus appealing to individuals who need to repay large debts and thereby discouraged from choosing them. I very much enjoyed the paper, so I just see the goal of my discussion is helping clarify the author contributions and hopefully provide some suggestions. So to this end, I'll elaborate on the identification of the role of student debt for wages, on the importance of human capital technologies and labor demand for their mechanism, and optimality of the policy proposed that is explained a bit better in the paper and only sketched or linked to the time constraints. They propose linking student grants to occupational choices post-college, which could lead to increases both in lifetime earnings and aggregate productivity. So what is the evidence on the role of student debt for wages? So the authors assess it by the extent to which debt affects wages and returns to experience, which in this regression, as you can see, are captured by this coefficient alpha 2 on student debt, and on the coefficient alpha 3 and the interaction between debt and experience by actively working. So the authors account for possible correlation between student debt and the error term via two distinct instrumental variable approaches that exploit respectively, as Arlene discussed, differences in relative grant amounts by college type as commonly done, and cleverly, I should say, Arlene didn't have time to discuss it, a certain non-limit policy discontinuity. The idea behind this latter instrument, that exogenous variation of the composition of college funding related to birth month and the age of a student graduations, identified the causal impact of debt on wages. My question here would be if the authors could clarify the exclusionary restrictions behind this instrument. The idea is that these loans are more generous to those turning 24 before graduation. Then students have an incentive to delay it, and if so is on graduation, possibly likely to be endogenous. My second question here is, what about the endogeneity of experience? The estimate of this coefficient, key coefficient alpha 3, may be affected by reverse causality. Suppose that individuals who earn higher wages are more likely to earn higher future wages and so more likely to work. And those with past high wages necessarily have higher experience. But then this dependence of experience on wages rather than the other way around may bias the impact of debt on returns to experience. One could argue that controlling for unobserved individual heterogeneity through fixed effects, as the authors do, could help solve this issue. But what about then the residual correlation between experience and the error term? Suppose that rather than the sum of a fixed effect and noise term, the error term is actually the sum of an autoregressive process and pure error. There's ample evidence that this form of heterogeneity is actually important for the wage growth process. For instance, MIP could capture persistent productivity shocks, say, when negative, individuals are less likely to work. But then experience would be positively correlated with the error term, and the impact of debt on returns to experience could be overstated. All of these potential threats to identification can be nonetheless overcome. They could be easily checked and possibly corrected through various methods, including expanding the author's IV scheme. So let me turn to the mechanism. The authors propose a life cycle occupational choice model with costly human capital investment through schooling because of tuition and post-schooling, as human capital requires commuting time that reduces labor supply. In the model, individuals are extremely heterogeneous in occupational talents and initial financial assets, and make educational, occupational, human capital acquisition, and consumption decisions subject to debt constraints, credit constraints actually. So an intuition for how this rich model works is as follows. Investing in human capital through college leads individuals to face binding credit constraints, which imply that individuals must repay their debt and so invest less in human capital when they are young in order to increase consumption. Now, this consumption smoothing motive induces the most constrained such individuals to opt for occupations whose wages are front-loaded, for which human capital is less important. And as a result, wage growth and acquired capital are smaller than if credit constraints were not binding. In a nutshell here, the burden of student debt inhibits, as Arlene was explaining, post-schooling human capital formations and distorts occupational choices. This leading to within and between occupations distortions. It's an important distinction. The first distortions arise when individuals invest less in human capital when employed, they should, given their occupational talents. And this is because investment in capital, in human capital and labor supply are rival. That is, they both compete for a worker's time. But what if human capital is mostly acquired instead as a byproduct of experience? There is robust evidence, in fact, of large returns to passive human capital acquisition and a small return to the active forms of human capital acquisition the authors envision, for instance, through on-the-job training. Also, the distinction, I would say, between working and investing is blurred in many jobs. From a technological point of view, most people become better at their jobs by working, and from a compensation point of view, as most active training is employer provided, and therefore firms pay for it. So this channel may not be quantitatively that important, even if qualitatively relevant in principle. As for between occupation distortions, they arise as individuals do not choose occupations that best match their talents. But what if, and Arlene mentioned it, individuals can switch across occupations at the jobs of an occupation, moving to higher wage growth jobs over time? Think about managers, for instance. Managers in sales divisions or middle rank positions tend to earn wages that are relatively insensitive to experience. But as they move to a higher level position, their wages become more and more sensitive to experience. This margin may therefore be relevant, especially as the authors focus on long-run lifestyle type of outcomes, and human capital is arguably transferable across similar jobs, so the cost of switching may be small. Abstracting through this margin may then overstate distortions as perhaps limited to the first occupations or job chosen after college. A broader question, in my opinion, is what determines wages here? Labor demand plays a key role, but so far is not explicitly modeled. To give an example, if you notice from the expression reported here of labor income from young and old workers, the authors assume that the wage per efficiency unit is fixed in each occupation, constant over time, and independent of worker characteristics. But as distortions are due to the financial frictions that workers face, certain long-term employment contracts conditional on worker characteristics and choices be beneficial, well, to workers by allowing for consumption smoothing, and to firms as well, by allowing them to pay less overall by simply front-loading wages. Intuitively here, long-term employment contracts can matter as effectively workers are more impatient than firms due to binding credit constraints. And indeed, this form of contracting is common in human capital-intensive occupations. Some contracts explicitly subsidize consumption. Think about, for instance, subsidy to mortgages. But if so, aren't distortions in this dimension less likely to be that severe? In general, I think it would be useful. It's a great paper in progress in this dimension. I understand it, but I think that a suggestion would be helpful if the authors clarify how wages are determined and importantly change with some of the policies they proposed. As firms are likely to respond, for instance, to changes in the skill distributions and market entrance from the policy considered. For instance, one of the policies they mentioned, linking grants to occupational choice, may incentivize firms to decrease wages since less talented individuals may now afford college.
So Elena, you should start wrapping up.
Yes, let me conclude with a few comments on the corrective measures that the authors propose. So they suggest a loan program that subsidizes more generously the students who pursue human capital intensive occupations, which will lead to gains in productivity and welfare. The question is it optimal to tie college grants to occupational choice after college? Not necessarily if individuals learn abilities and preferences while in school. Work by Arcidiacono and co-authors show that schooling is an important stage of discovery of talents and work aptitudes. So the proposed policy may end up constraining educational and occupational choices at a time students are poorly informed and end up exacerbating some of the impact of that on human capital formation. Also, one suggestion is how about the earned income tax credit? It's an existing wage subsidy policy that is tailored to worker characteristics. For instance, it is highly nonlinear in income, so it could be effective at promoting human capital investment if better tied to the human capital intensity of an occupation. Moreover, given its present, maybe the current loan programs we see may be less distortionary than estimated. Let me conclude saying it's a very interesting, important paper, a must read, that suggests important long-term effects of early indebtedness on life cycle and kind of formations and wage growth, and these summary suggestions. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question. Can you unmute yourself and ask it? I see a raised hand. Wenli.
Yes, hi. Yeah, really nice paper, very topical. I have a question. So I've looked at the student loan debt data from the Equifax. I remember I'm actually pretty sure it's bimodal in the sense that, you have like people with very little student loan debt, and those are the ones who went to perhaps, for-profit colleges who failed, who didn't finish. And then you have, some professionals with huge amount of debt, right? The MBAs, the doctors. I imagine their future career path, the impact of student loans on their wages would be quite different. So I don't know this, the wage data would allow you to look at them separately. I suppose the regressions that Arlene you run picking up the average effect in this case can be misleading, at least from the loan, the student loan debt point of view because of this bimodal phenomenon. Okay, thank you. Very nice paper.
I think Valerie had raised her hand.
Actually, I was going to make a similar point to Wenli. I just want to talk, there seem to be three kinds of people with student debt, making it simple. And there's a wonderful paper by Adam Looney and Yannelis in Brookings in around 2016, and they have really detailed data from the Treasury. And just simplifying it, it seems like there are three types. One is the traditional undergrad who goes to a good college, and that amount of debt hasn't gone up that much, and there's not a lot of default from that. Then there's the other traditional, somebody in dental school, medical school, they're not a problem. They have lots of debt, but they pay it off because they have a high income. The real problem, and the one that's been rising over time, is the students who go to non-traditional colleges, such as for-profit colleges, and even taking out debt for in junior college. And these are the ones most likely to default. And so I just want to follow up on Wenli's comment. It would be really interesting if you could divide your group that and see if you get similar results when you do that division, when you run your regressions.
And then one more, Oskana wanted to ask something, and then we can go to the answers.
So I just had a time series question. You mentioned, you started by talking about how student debt has gone up by a factor of 3, I think, since the mid-90s. So I'm just wondering, do you expect then to see lower returns to experience now? Or at least, I guess, if we're looking at the younger cohort, we may not observe them long enough to see returns to experience, but at least you should be able to see a shift of occupations towards those with perhaps a higher initial wage and lower wage growth over time. So I just was wondering if you could comment on that.
I'll respond first, and then maybe I'll see Titan if you want to jump in and add anything as well. So thanks so much, Elena, for the great discussion. It's really helpful and really thought-provoking. So, and also for the questions that come up. So let me kind of maybe jump to the questions that are asked and maybe then circle back to some thoughts on the discussion. So I thought Wenli and Valerie's point about the types of the bimodal, or the types of different college types is a really interesting point. So I think it would be really interesting to run the regressions we have for the different groups of people, which we haven't done before. One thing I would say is right now, those regressions which are giving the average effect is controlling for college type. So it's not being driven purely by debt being correlated with the for-profit lower ability groups of people, because we are explicitly controlling for that. And we're able to do that because the geocode data we got tells us what's the name of the schools. Having said that, I think it would be interesting then to stratify the data, like Valerie was suggesting, and see whether these distortions, especially effects on returns to experience, are even stronger for the subset of people who are choosing to go into the non-traditional colleges. And I suspect that's going to be the case. And I think that would be kind of interesting because maybe that's really the group where the misallocation is strongest. So right now we're sort of showing average effects. We know it's not being driven by quality of college, but it could be stronger effects for certain groups of people. So I think that would kind of be really super interesting to look at. Oksana had a really interesting question. You know, what I'm showing you, especially with the occupation choices, is for the subset of people in NLSY where a lot of variation is you know, partly in the cross section, but very naturally has some time series implications in there. Because student debt's been going up, there are some testable implications might be, are you seeing selection early in the 90s versus now in occupations that are correlated with the profile. So that's something I think we could test for, because there is the National Survey of College collegiates, which would allow us to kind of look at that time series implication. And one thing we've sort of, Ty and Emily and I have been discussing is that it would be really interesting to explore that time series and think about implications of those occupation choices and on the job training for the skill premium, which is something more structurally changing as well. Tyden, did you have anything you wanted to jump in and add?
Nothing specific. All the questions were really fantastic. I would say to Oksana, this is exactly kind of the thing that we're pushing on now. This idea that, just to kind of parrot what Arlene was saying, this idea that the lower returns to experience and the way debt inhibits people's ability to realize the returns to college, we believe that the rise in student debt might partially be responsible for the slowing down in the growth of the skill premium. And so this is exactly something we're looking at in the quantitative model. We totally agree with you. Soon we should be able to tell you to what extent we really think it's quantitatively going on. But yes, we're looking at it.